Thank you for coming to the latest instalment of the Centre for Welsh Studies webinars. This one's on CANZUK and Wales, and is it a bright future? Could it work for Wales, and could it work for the UK as a whole? I'm delighted to be joined by three fantastic guests. Firstly, Craig Williams. He's the MP for Montgomeryshire, PPS to the Treasury, so he's been very busy today on Budget Day, and he's on the APPG for CANZUK, so a great guest to have for this. Next, we're joined by Ed Fast. He's the MP for Abbotsford in Canada. He's a former Trade Minister and now the representative on CANZUK relations for Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition under Erin O'Toole for the Canadian Conservatives. So another fantastic and highly esteemed guest for us to have. And last but certainly not least is James Skinner. He's the Chief Exec of CANZUK International and has worked in Australia, the UK, and he's actually from Wales himself. So it's always good to have another Welshman on the webinar series. So yeah, I'll kick this off with basically, why CANZUK? Why would it work for Wales? Why do you think it's now the right time for CANZUK to be implemented? And I'll start with you, James.
Yeah, sure. Well, Edward, thank you also for having me on here. Like I say, it's great to be talking about two things that I absolutely love, being CANZUK and Wales, seeing as I'm born and raised there. So for those perhaps tuning in who might not know much about CANZUK, it's effectively a diplomatic alliance between Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. And the campaign that I formulated back in 2015 was to get these four countries to work closer together on diplomatic arrangements, primarily through reciprocal migration based on the already existing agreement that Australia and New Zealand have, free trade and foreign policy cooperation too. And I have no doubt we'll probably go into those three elements throughout this event, so I won't bore you with the details, but effectively it was these three elements that I thought would be tremendously opportunistic for these four countries, and even for regional entities like Wales itself. Obviously, Wales, having grown up there, it's a phenomenal place. And of course, I'm absolutely biased, so I'm not expecting anybody to take my word on this, but Wales is a phenomenal place. The people are fantastic, they're hardworking, and I think Wales itself would thrive and prosper within a CANZUK arrangement, not only having opportunities like they currently do throughout the UK, but to also have opportunities in countries which are so like-minded to us, being that they speak a similar majority language, have the same common law legal system, same parliamentary style democracy, respect for human rights and the rule of law. You could take your average Welsh person from Cardiff, Aberystwyth, Swansea, wherever they may be, drop them in the middle of Saskatchewan, drop them in the middle of Auckland, Sydney, Melbourne, wherever it may be, and they could still feel right at home as if they were, living and working in Cardiff. So I think the opportunities for Wales are tremendous in this sense, and the benefits that can come from reciprocal migration, trade, and foreign policy between these four countries is only going to allow Wales to thrive and prosper in the future, in my opinion.
Some great points, and some points I wholeheartedly agree with. And I'll move on to you next, Ed. Why do you think, coming from a Canadian perspective as well, so he's got also from a CANZUK perspective, why would it be right for not to Wales, to the UK? Why is now the right time to put this idea between our four countries?
Well, as you all know, CANZUK predates the COVID pandemic. Erin O'Toole and many others, James among them, have been strong proponents of a four-country alliance that would allow us to speak as one voice on the global stage in many different areas. It's not only on trade, it would be on investment, it would be on things like foreign policy, defense and security. But the advantage we have, the opportunity we have now post-COVID, is that the global economy has been devastated by this pandemic. Coming out of this, we face all kinds of challenges, economic challenges. We know that the United States has turned inward, as have other economies around the world. We see an emasculation of the World Trade Organization under Donald Trump. How do we resurrect a vigorous rules-based trade environment? Well, it's for the four most like-minded countries in the world, the countries of CANZUK, to come together and promote these values on the world stage. We all share the same approach to freer and fairer trade. on the global stage. We share common approaches to foreign policy. We're all members of the Five Eyes. So that is sort of the context in which we find ourselves post-COVID. If you were looking for low-hanging fruit to recharge the global economy, this would be it. But I think we would make a mistake in overemphasizing the trade component of CANZUK, because amongst our 4 countries, of course, the low-hanging fruit has already been picked, because we have bilateral and plurilateral agreements amongst each other, and now the UK has applied to join the TPP. And so what is it about CANZUK that provides us with additional opportunities? And there's a long list of them. As I've consulted, I've reached out to stakeholders. I won't go into them right now. You may have a further question, Edward, maybe a little bit further down the road. I'd be glad to walk through some of the things that I've been able to glean and distill from my connections with stakeholders in all of our countries. There are, every time you turn over a rock, there's new opportunities for us as CANZUK parties to collaborate on.
I completely agree. It's, there's a lot we can delve into, which I'm sure we will when we have got plenty of questions to come, which are some reminders to attendees. I've just typed in the chat box, and to the rest of the attendees, don't forget to send in your questions. So we'll try and get through as many as possible in the time we have. But that was some great points. So I'll move on to next to Craig. Craig, what is it about for you, CANZUK? Obviously, you're newly returned to Parliament in 2019. You quite recently joined into that Parliament, the CANZUK APPG. What is it for you and CANZUK you think will benefit Wales in particular?
Thanks, Ed, and thanks for hosting this. And not to reiterate many of Ed's Canada Ed points, I agree with a lot of that, and you can get lost in just talking about trade in this. Ed alluded to our Five Eyes, the signal intelligence sharing, the other bilaterals we have. Where we do our full battalion army training is in Canada. It's an essential part of the British Army's training. Our bases over near Calgary. But if you do look at the trade, and if you look at not just the normal goods and services, but FDI, foreign direct investment, back in 2018 we were doing 50 billion. If you scrape any of the UK strategic assets, such as our regional airports, you will find a Canadian pension fund. We are completely interlinked in terms of our economies, and it was incredibly natural. I sit on the International Trade Committee in Parliament, and it was incredibly natural to look at the CANZUK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Of course, as Ed alluded to, he wants to get into CPTPP now, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And this all co-aligns, but what we don't want to get lost in is just seeing this in terms of trade numbers. We are intrinsically linked, as James alluded to, not just law, not just head of state, not just language, but the way we think and with the way we approach a lot of the challenges we are now facing. Protecting intellectual property, regulating ethically the technological developments around artificial intelligence. A lot of the world's countries are looking to that body of nations for regulatory change, how we're going to tackle the fourth industrial revolution, how we are going to tackle China, let's be honest, on intellectual property and the other trade challenges and the other security challenges emerging too. And time after time, rock, as Ed alluded to, every time you turn a rock, you see the great opportunity between our great countries, either leading in some kind of regulatory way and using our great common law book and the way we approach the regulation in terms of ethicals. In terms of the artificial intelligence alone is something that we can lead the world on. But just the physical trade numbers as well are very attractive. It is very timely. I obviously didn't realize when you were pulling this together it was budget day, but the OBR stuff today is predicating on us growing our way as well as tackling that fiscal nightmare we currently have after the COVID, and we can do that together in terms of common nations far easier than we can do it apart. And of course, we are looking to replace a lot of. We are leaving the European Union. We have left. We are now looking to a body of nations we have common terms with to look at what replaces Erasmus, the Turing scheme, to look at what replaces in terms of seasonal labour, looking at Australia and New Zealand in particular. And my young farmers have always gone to those countries. They never went to France or Germany on exchange programs. So there is a great deal of common practice that James alluded to. It is far bigger than trade, as Ed alluded to, and most of the shared challenges as we have as countries would be better solved together.
Some really good points there, and like you say, it's so multifaceted. It really is interesting. We have some great questions, in which I'll move on to next. Some really good questions on different facets, and as soon as you start to read through some of the questions, some of the discussions I've had this in the past, you really start to see how wide varied and how much area this covers a policy. It's not just like, say, one area of trade or migration. It's so multifaceted, and it's what makes it so potentially good for the UK and Wales. So I'll move on to this question. I'll start with one left of field, which I think was a really good question that got sent in before. And it says this: with many young people in the UK feeling their internationalism has been taken away from them thanks to Brexit, is CANZUK a chance for the government in the UK to offer them a branch to show that the UK's internationalist credentials? I'm start with you again, Craig. We'll start with you.
Well, I think I started to allude to this, but it absolutely is, and it already is. It was when we were members of the EU. I touched on I represent a huge rural community. That's huge in the UK sense, not Canada sense. But it is massive here, and we have a lot of farmers, a lot of young farmers, and they were sponsored. They went to the countries we are describing. They didn't participate in the Erasmus, and the Erasmus was particularly focused on a certain type of demographic in the student. If you look at who went there, I'm afraid they were normally well-heeled. They were very middle class. They already normally spoke another European language. But the Turing scheme and the thing we're trying to develop needs to be much more all-embracing. It needs to be about giving opportunities, and not just young people as well, but really a global reach. And the most obvious places you always start are, of course, countries like the ones we are describing, where there's a lot of commonality to it. But, I would just go back to looking at the schemes that have already happened, and I would use the Young Farming Network as that, being from Montgomeryshire on my background, as we have very, very strong links with Australia. We have very strong links with New Zealand, and that kind of Turing scheme for me would be massively beneficial. And of course, looking forward to many, many years in advance as we all mature with the European Union. Now we've had our divorce. Israel is a member of Erasmus. I have no doubt there'll be ways of benefiting and building a scheme together using Turing as the framework where we continue those links. Of course we do, with our nearest and dearest neighbor, but we are going to common countries on a number of frameworks, and we can get young people easily sent across the globe.
I completely agree. I'll put this open this up to you, Ed, this question as well. Do you believe this is a chance, and then sort from a UK perspective, that for the UK government to show international credentials? This is something I don't know, because it's been proposed by many people on the right, conservative parties across the nations. Usually we see conservative parties be called parties for the older generation, so the older people. They're not in touch with what the young, more internationalist views want these days. So do you think this is an idea to show that maybe free marketers, conservatives actually are in touch with younger voters and actually do have common ground?
Yes, very much so. In fact, if I were directing my comments to a Eurosceptic coming out of the Brexit environment, I would say, listen, you've got an opportunity now to re-engage in the world in a very expedited way with countries that are like-minded, and you will preserve your sovereignty. There's no ceding of policy-making powers to a supranational government, say in Brussels. That's not what we're talking about. This is not a political union. It is not a common currency. What we are is 4 sovereign countries that want to leverage our common values and our common approaches to global issues to greater value, not only for our own citizens, but for the citizens of the world. Because we're setting an example, we're really becoming a role model for the world to follow. Because post-COVID, people are scrambling to try to understand, what does the future look like? What does the global economy look like in the future? We have an opportunity to effectively set the agenda for that. And in terms of appealing to a broad cross-section of supporters for CANZUK, I would hope that we wouldn't restrict this to conservative-minded parties and individuals and stakeholder groups, that we would reach beyond that, because the benefits of CANZUK, they extend beyond party lines. I would note that CANZUK actually has one of its defining features as freeing up the mobility of our citizens to work, study, and play in each other's countries. And when I think of the under 40s who've grown up in the digital age, they want to be global citizens. They want to explore the world, but they want to pursue their careers within an environment, within a digital environment. They can actually pursue their careers in any of our 4 countries and still remain in touch with their home country. And by providing them with a freer ability to move amongst their 4 countries, I believe that will become one of the key selling points. And beyond that, in terms of the productivity, the competitiveness of our 4 economies, think about us being able to much better rationalize our human resources, being able to improve skills development, and also the attraction and recruiting of talent within our 4 countries, and doing it more efficiently. There's tremendous opportunities for us to appeal well beyond just a traditional conservative constituency.
I completely agree. I completely agree. I thought it was a great question to get started on, as this could really energize the youth. And James, let's put this question to you again quickly. Do you think this is the way to win over generational sport, should I say?
Absolutely, and it's great being on this panel with Craig and Ed, because they just sum up everything beautifully, and it just gives me an easy opportunity just to tack it on the end. But everything they say is 100% spot on, and you know, I think as well, in terms of the, especially like for when I was a younger man, it seems like an age ago now, but the very first countries that I went to when I left university was Australia and Canada, and hence the reason why I now reside in Canada today, because these countries are so like-minded. It's incredibly easy for me to get a job in these countries because I speak the same language. I can assimilate easily. I can get an apartment, a house, whatever it may be. And as much as I love Europe, and I've always traveled to Europe, it's simply these benefits with the CANZUK countries that you don't get in Europe, primarily because of the linguistic differences. And just tying on as well to what Craig and Ed was saying, I view CANZUK as somewhat of a more commonsensical approach to the European Union. And that's not to disrespect the European Union in any way, but obviously a majority of Wales voted for Brexit back in the referendum of 2016. But the thing to emphasize here that I think is much more beneficial for younger people, working professionals, even those 50, 60 years plus, is that CANZUK actually offers a lot of benefits which the EU did not, primarily because of obviously the assimilation and the close ties we have between each other. But also as well, in terms of free movement, which was a concern for a lot of people in the EU, it's not the same principle under CANZUK. So there is reciprocal migration, obviously, whereby a British person, Welsh person can live and work in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. But of course, it is based on what the already existing agreement is in place right now between Australia and New Zealand, called the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement, whereby you can live and work freely in these countries, but at the same time, you do have to conform to certain health and security requirements. So for example, you mustn't have a criminal record or a serious criminal record, otherwise you cannot travel. You mustn't have an infectious health condition. You mustn't be on a national security watch list or affiliated with any terrorist organizations. So there's these security measures in place. And as Ed rightly alluded to as well, there's no threat of losing our sovereignty like many people would argue that we had with the European Union. There would be no national parliament, no currency, no common legal system and no Supreme Court, like what the European Union was going towards, even a common army, which of course is a big concern for people right now. So CANZUK is simply an alliance of 4 countries who would retain their sovereignty and also provide these benefits for young people, working professionals, to go and live and work in these countries, which are so like-minded. And I think it would just be beneficial for everybody.
Some great points there, and some I completely agree with about from all 3 panelists there about the youth, this and how the movement of people is such a strong element of this alongside other elements. And one other element of this, which has been put to us from a question from the attendees, Ross Evans, he asked, would the panelists like CANZUK to include a defence element similar to NATO's Article 5? So I'll put it straight again to you, James. Would you like to see CANZUK include a defence element similar to NATO's Article 5 or something along those lines?
Yeah, I think obviously a defence element is a key component of CANZUK right now. I mean, obviously, in recent years, we've seen a lot of, I guess you could say, hostile actions coming from other countries, which are not so friendly to the West in any way. I mean, obviously, we're seeing the rise of China right now with a lot of anti-human rights policies that they're putting forward. And of course, I think a lot of especially the CANZUK countries, they're all on watch to see what is going to progress in the future with China. Obviously, you've got other adversarial actions being created through Iran, North Korea. So, of course, the defense element between the CANZUK countries is, in course, incredibly beneficial in the long run to preserve our security and our place in the international sphere. I mean, like I say, CANZUK wouldn't in any way advocate for a common army, but it certainly does see the merit in our military capabilities acting as 4 nations, sovereign nations, but working together for our military capabilities. For example, I think the combined military expenditure of our 4 countries alone would be $110 billion US dollars, which would make us the 3rd largest military and defense power in the world. And tying that to Wales as well, obviously, Wales has a phenomenal budget for military expenditure. I think somewhere in the region of about £1.75 billion. What that is in Canadian dollars, I don't have the mathematical brain to even work that out, but it's a terrific amount. And obviously, having that contribute as well to a CANZUK arrangement, I think would only, not only increase our security and our defense collaboration, but also as well provide endless opportunities for jobs and work experience and, security enhancement for Welsh people looking to go into the military and, create a safer world for everybody. And, as Ed was also pointing out too as well, obviously it's a shining example for the rest of the world how 4 like-minded countries can work together in this way to work towards human rights and to work towards international collaboration and create a safer world for everybody. So I think obviously, in my opinion, I think a defense arrangement between these countries is incredibly beneficial and fruitful for the years ahead.
Yeah, some great points. You're right to point out Wales' high prestigious military history, and still to this day with army bases based in Brecon and whatnot. So yeah, we're very lucky in that sense, and it would fit in well. I'll put this question to you next, Ed. Would you like to see? I'm guessing what you said you would, but why would you like to see a defence element involved in CANZUK? What would it improve? How would it safeguard the lives of the people involved in CANZUK? How would it improve their safety?
Well, I believe that CANZUK provides us with the forum within which we can speak together as one voice. It's already been pointed out that there are hostile regimes around the world who are taking advantage of our individual countries, but they're also taking advantage of the international system, the multilateral institutions that we've established to keep peace and order within the global community. Much of that is being undermined right now. And the more that we stand alone rather than together, the more likely we're going to be picked off. I mean, I'm looking at all 4 of the countries. Certainly for Canada, China, for example, is our 2nd largest trading partner. It's the #1 trading partner for New Zealand and Australia. I don't know where it stands for the UK, but it would be high up. And that is a point of vulnerability for all of us. And when I see how belligerent China has become towards Canada, clearly the more that we speak as one voice, especially with the UK being at the table and being a very significant power within the global community, the more effective we will be in pushing back against these hostile actions. The fact that we're all members of the Five Eyes, I think, is a huge benefit. But being able to act independently to some degree from the United States, because we operate in a bipolar world effectively, and for us as four middle powers to be able to speak as one voice, speak softly but firmly, I believe is going to be a huge advantage, especially as the global community is looking for leadership in all of these areas, whether it's global security, whether it's defense, whether it's trade and investment, whether it's on foreign policy, whether it's on human rights. We can coordinate our efforts in an incredible way if we band together under an alliance that is premised on common values.
Completely agree, and especially really your points on China. Like you say, we've seen invigorated China, and like you say, the West now needs to, especially our four countries, need to take a stronger stand together to, like you say, avoid being picked off, as which we could see happening. Like if we're not very careful, even you mentioned the UK with our strong economy and world stage, the Chinese economy outstrips us all. So, like I say, putting us together, a stronger union together will be much more beneficial. So I'll move this on to Craig. Would you like to see CANZUK include a defense element? If so, why?
Well, I'm going to push back a little bit and say, look, NATO does a good job. We support NATO. We're completely behind NATO. All countries are signed up, and we shouldn't seek to replicate what NATO does. We should all be reinforcing that through either our in terms of our contribution per GDP to the military aspects of NATO, and of course standing firmly behind that article that Ross alluded to. But that doesn't mean, of course, because what we're seeing is hostile states and big major actors in the cyber sphere acting very hostile. Now, the Five Eyes, which Ed already mentioned, I won't go over that again, is the gold standard of signal intelligence around the world. We should be incredibly proud that that's already happening in a sense. You have that alliance already there. But we need to be acting with our soft power much more cleverly. A lot of countries have pulled out of Africa. We need to get back in there big style with our aid budgets to help countries, because China has walked into that vacuum. And other countries, both, so you've got the hostile actors in the cyberspace, which we need to take on quite directly. And of course, we can do that much better together. But we need to use soft power through international aid to help emerging economies meet their climate change, the Paris Accords, through proper aid, proper development monies from us, and we need to make sure that they are not being coerced or lent on by other actors in this space. I don't want to go up and down and seem China obsessed, but we can really lean on our soft power. But I will push back on of course we work closely together. Again, I alluded to our training facilities that we share with North America, based in Canada. The Americans use it, we use it, Canadians use it. They are incredibly important platforms in our UK military. And the Five Eyes, but we really do genuinely need to build on the soft power together. And as we emerge out of the EU, because of course there was a very slow kind of drip of our foreign affairs to the European Union. None of us wanted it. That's why we had Brexit, I should imagine. But again, I'm not going to regurgitate that argument. But now we are standing alone again. We need partners to tackle what has happened in a vacuum as people left developing nations such as the continent of Africa.
Yeah, some great points there. We've got a very interesting question which could be put to both. Why do we only see politicians on the right, say conservative free market politicians, only advocating for CANZUK? Predominantly, there are a few exceptions, predominantly advocating for CANZUK UK. And how can we make CANZUK more inclusive to other parties and other people it does go on, but other political parties and other political persuasions. So I'll put this to you straight away, Craig. How do you think we can make this more inclusive, that it doesn't come across to maybe some people as a right-wing fantasy idea? This is actually a good idea for normal people.
I'd never accuse you of that, Ed. But what I would say is I think we need to look at our shared standards, be they animal welfare standards, be they labor standards. You know, you can look at the labor markets in all our respective countries and see some quite powerful world leadership on standards. And, you know, at the moment, we are having a great debate about the WTO and its role, its reinvigorated role, hopefully, in how does it address the whole climate change agenda in trade? How does it address the whole animal welfare and production standards? You know, these are elements that the WTO has just kicked down the can down the road constantly, but they are newly emerging discussions around trade that we're not just having bilaterally anymore. If you look, the Australians are incredibly proud of their production and welfare standards. We are, especially, as is everyone else. And I think that space is where you could build some consensus. But, you know, I'm not that concerned about, you know, the left being not engaged in this space, because, you know, I think it weakens their position on broader issues, and it weakens their appeal to the electorate. So, you know, Ed, don't be helping my opponents become more appealing. I think let's stick with centre right, and let's stick with global politics, in the sense that we want to work together, but we don't want to be going around telling each other what to do.
Don't worry, Craig. I'm not trying to make sure there's anyone snapping at your heels come 2024. Don't worry. I'll move this question on to you, Ed. How do you think we can make this a more inclusive movement? Because obviously your role for Owner Tool is to sort of build a consensus on this. How do you see it as building a consensus from maybe left to right, or even centre to right? How do you see this going? How do you see this building this and inviting the people in? You're on mute, Ed.
Sorry, I'm having difficulty understanding you. There's a little bit of an echo there. So I think your question was, how do we expand the reach of CANZUK to include people across the political spectrum? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, and I want to build on Craig's remarks as well. I've actually been encouraged by the stakeholders I've engaged with so far in Australia, in New Zealand. There appears to be a general understanding that if CANZUK is actually properly framed, it does hold value for parties across the political spectrum to pursue their common goals. Because what we're doing is we are promoting a broader prosperity in our countries, a respectful prosperity, one that is fair, that is shared more equally. I also wanted to address, if you don't mind, Ed, the question that came up on your chat in the chat room, which has to do with the regions: Wales, Scotland, Quebec, independence movement, Ireland or Northern Ireland. How should we expect them to respond? How would we respond? And I would say this, just from my experience in Canada with Quebec. Quebec is amongst the most pro-trade oriented provinces in our federation, which is a great starting point. In all the trade agreements that I was able to negotiate in my previous life, Quebec was always at the forefront promoting trade. We never had a problem bringing the province of Quebec on side. And irrespective of the independence movements that tend to percolate in our regions, over the years, I found that the regions like Western Canada, like Atlantic Canada and Quebec, even our Indigenous communities generally understand the value of expanding Canada's footprint in the world when it comes to trade, when it comes to attracting investment. And when you then partner that with an opportunity to speak as one voice on issues such as human rights and on foreign policy and our place in the world, and reflecting our role as a middle power, a softer, gentler, but respected, trustworthy power within the global community, that is a really attractive argument. And so far, I haven't sensed much, if any, resistance when it comes to promoting a CANZUK type of alliance, provided that it's based on consultation with our regions, and we genuinely reach out and glean from them their interests in a broader CANZUK negotiation.
There's some great points there. And what you say about nationalism, don't worry, the next question is going to be on that. I've had a whole deluge of questions on that. But firstly, James, I'll answer this question to you because I think this is a very good question for you with your organisation. How do you make it? How are you trying to bring it as make it as most cross-party and across the spectrum as possible to bring in from all corners? How have you tried to do that, and how are you going to try and do that in the future?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, and where Craig and I can probably provide a parliamentary perspective on it, I can probably bring to it an advocacy and lobbying perspective. So the work we do at CANZUK International is we work with anybody and everybody who is supportive of CANZUK, and it has been certainly true that in the early days of the campaign, it certainly was a center-right leaning sort of initiative. You know, majority of the support we had from members of parliament and senators was those in the conservative or the national parties of each of the respective countries. But from my perspective, what I've seen, especially in the last 2 years or so, is that there has actually been a tremendous shift from it being, I guess you could say, a center-right initiative to actually being a dead center initiative. Publicly, we've seen the polls that have, polling that's being commissioned, not only by us to, commissioned by independent polling firms and companies, but others elsewhere, like the Royal Commonwealth Society, have shown that the public support there is tremendous. So in the UK, I think the most recent stats show that about 70% of people in the UK support CANZUK, and that's including 70% of people in Wales too. When you look to Canada, it's 76%, Australia 73%, New Zealand is 82%. So there's significant public support there. In terms of political support, like I said, obviously, yeah, it certainly was a center-right initiative, but over the years, we've now started to see that become a more central issue. And I think polling in the UK has recently demonstrated this. A company there, Savanta Comres, only recently released polling results from about maybe 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago maximum, where they polled a number of MPs in the UK Parliament. 61% of members of Parliament said that they actually supported reciprocal migration between Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. 72% of Labour members of Parliament supported it. So there's a significant majority of Labour MPs who support it as well. And then even going to the House of Lords, we have about 65 to 70% of the House of Lords, and that's including Conservatives, Labour, and crossbenchers who also support the idea of CANZUK and believe it's going to be a significant player in the years ahead. Also from the outreach we've done across Australia, New Zealand, we've seen, I've seen again, there has been that centre-right sort of lean towards it, but there have certainly been Labour members of Parliament who have also come back and said, you know what, this is a great idea. And they recognise the mutual benefits that I think Conservatives, Labour, right-wing, left-wing, however you want to frame it, they recognise the mutual benefits that CANZUK would play in terms of the opportunities it gives for people in these 4 countries to live and work and travel, the business opportunities that provides, the employment opportunities, how free trade can work in terms of reducing tariffs, barriers to commerce, providing mutual skills recognition for working professionals, how foreign policy can also help with that in terms of expanding our relationship with the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance and the UK seat on the United Nations Security Council. So these are all things whereby, yes, it did have a right-leaning sort of initiative behind it, but it has now become more centralized, especially in the last year or so, because I feel more and more people are starting to realize that this is actually beneficial for everybody, regardless of which side of the benches we sit on in terms of Labour or Conservative or wherever we may lie. So I think it's definitely going to improve towards the centre as we move forward as well.
That's positive news. The more people that can get behind the idea, the better it will be, I think. And we'll move on to the question that Ed alluded to, which is a very poignant question, especially being here in Wales. Do the panelists think, there's many questions, so I'll just read one version we've had here. Do panelists think that having a partnership like CANZUK would help quell nationalist tendencies in Wales, Scotland, Quebec? It says here, but I feel like Quebec is much less of an issue right now with independence compared to where we are in Wales and Scotland. Do you think being in favour of a bigger partnership, we saw it with the European Union, that claim where if you vote to leave the EU, or in Scotland 2014, you vote to leave Scotland, you vote to leave the EU, you vote to leave. Would that argument still work the same, do you think? I'll start with you, Craig. Do you think the argument would work similarly, and this would quell nationalist tendencies, putting this towards the nationalists, saying the whole part of the UK, we're not as better and stronger as part of the Union, we're actually part of CANZUK, and the whole list of arrangements that gives us?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it clearly is an issue for the United Kingdom at the moment. But I always say that we were big enough and ugly enough to allow a part of the United Kingdom to ask whether they wanted to leave or not. And you look at other countries around the world, and I don't want to poke Spain too much. But Scotland had a referendum. They voted to remain in the United Kingdom, and it was a once in a generation ask. Now I know how long generations are in Wales, and it's a little bit longer before we get to the next generation question for that. But I'm going to turn the question around, not quite as negative, and make it positive. I think that this and other relationships around the world, and I don't want to just chuck around sound bites like global Britain, but we did become quite lazy and actually inward looking as members of the EU. We have now an opportunity and a requirement and a necessity to be much more globally outward. This is the most obvious and the low-hanging fruit, as it's been described, to sign up to. But actually, fast forward the United Kingdom in a couple of years, when it's not just rolled over agreements that we had quite lazily with the EU, but very sensibly during the transition period. Fast forward where we've got significant freedom of movement agreements with Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Fast forward when we've got stronger bilaterals with other countries, and fast forward where you can go through the Turing scheme and go and work, play, study all the way around the world. I think we could be much more outwardly looking and much less interested in some of this nasal gazing of where's our little place in the world. Do we want to divide even further, or we are a part of a much wider family of nations around the world that respect each other's sovereignty, which can play rugby against each other on a Saturday in a very different way than we govern, and I think have that outwardly looking vision, which would help massively, I think, tackle the quite divisive and very obsessed with inwardly looking political discourse we have in some areas, not all areas. And I think the polling which you showed about our want and our need to form an ever closer relationship with Canada is reinforces what that will look like in a couple of years.
Brilliant. I'll move this on to you, Ed. I know it's a harder question to answer, but do you think something like this could perhaps entice people that were maybe thinking, actually, the UK's not working for me, that maybe actually this is down, like say Craig says, down the road, that once you get all these agreements and deals done, this will be more enticing for Brits to want to stay part of Britain, and maybe Quebec is part of Quebec?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the internal affairs of Britain, of the United Kingdom. I will comment on the state of play in Canada, in Quebec. Separatism as a movement in Canada has significantly diminished as a force. Right now, we're not debating separatism in Canada, although I would be quite prepared to admit that within Quebec, there are still people that, yearn for an independent Quebec. It's one thing to be nationalistic. It's another thing to be a separatist. And, we fully expect that Quebecers would be fiercely defensive of their culture, of their language, of their place in our federation, and they're very aggressive on that. But they are also amongst the most globally oriented of our Canadian citizens. And that's why when I mentioned earlier that when it comes to trade and reaching out to the world and opening up new opportunities, Quebec is at the forefront on that. And the more that we as a country, as Canadians, engage with the global community, especially where we share common values, and those common values anchor our existence as an alliance, I believe that just makes it that much more attractive for Quebec to stay within the Federation, and for Quebecers to understand that they have a valuable role to play within our Canadian Federation, but also within the global community. And so I'm very optimistic. I'm very encouraged by the outreach I've had so far, and we'll continue that going forward.
And I put the same question to you, James. Do you think this could potentially, as a Brit yourself, do you think this could potentially stave off the threats of nationalism towards it through this idea?
I would certainly hope so. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a mind reader, but I mean, if we're taking Wales, for example, I think the most recent polling in Wales has indicated that only about 7% of Wales is interested in separatism. I could be wrong. Obviously, Edward, you probably know more than me, but I think it was last time I checked about 7%.
Unfortunately, I'm the bearer of bad news to say it was around 21% the last time I checked, but it's still under a good it's still too high for my liking, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's obviously raised quite a bit then. All the polling I looked at was obviously wrong. I think it was from YouGov. So obviously that's, yeah, it's obviously much higher. So, but still nonetheless higher than what I obviously said, but still a minority. So, you know, I think obviously a lot of the separatist argument also comes down to play in terms of what the national government is doing. So there's things in terms of separatism which are completely independent of CANZUK, no matter how much of a greater job we do with CANZUK. If the national government is doing things which the separatists are not enjoying, and the majority of people for Wales, for example, are not liking, then of course it's going to become difficult. And of course, that in turn, being realistic, does make things a little bit trickier for CANZUK, because instead of negotiating these different agreements like mutual skills recognition, perhaps the reciprocal healthcare agreements, you know, for emergency coverage in these countries, which Australia, New Zealand, and the UK are already part of. You know, negotiating agreements like this does become a lot trickier, because instead of having 4 voices at the table, you now essentially have 5 voices at the table. And of course, you know, if Scotland chooses to separate, you then have 6 voices at the table. And before you know it, it becomes a lot harder to negotiate, because a lot more people have a lot more things to say, and there's a lot more conflicting views on issues. So for the future, I would certainly hope that there wouldn't be any sort of separatist agendas from Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland. In my honest opinion, though, would CANZUK provide an opportunity for people to perhaps think, well, actually, no, separatism wouldn't work because the benefits of CANZUK outweigh my nationalist sentiment in that way? I think it would for a lot of people, absolutely. Like you rightly pointed out, there's a minority of people in Wales right now who support separatism, and that's even without CANZUK currently being in place, as it's only a campaign and an idea that's moving forward tremendously, but it's still not there yet. So already a minority of people in Wales don't want to be separate. I think if we add CANZUK to that initiative, I think absolutely that 21% that you said, I think would diminish down to 15, 10%, maybe even the 7% that I wrongly stated. So we'd have to see, but I think absolutely it would be an effective measure, especially for the people of Wales, that they wouldn't necessarily need to be separate from the UK, because the benefits they would have from CANZUK would be so much more than if they were just simply to go it alone.
Thank you. And I'll move, I think we've got one last question. We've had this quite a few times sent in the Q&A box beforehand. And I'll start this one off with Ed. How long would this take, and how do we go about? People are asking, how long would this take, and how do these 4 nations go about actually taking this from a theory, an idea, actually putting it into practice?
That's a great question, and it's one that we certainly discussed here in Canada, certainly within our conservative team here. It's going to require a critical mass, a tipping point for this to move forward in a very formal way. It will likely require an alignment of stars when it comes to governments that are prepared to negotiate agreements like this. Although I would never foreclose the possibility of having governments of different political stripes coming to the table and saying, this is good for our 4 countries. It's good for the global community. Let's move forward and do it. I have reached out to a number of different parties in each of the different countries. We're going to continue to do so. We want to do it respectfully. We want to understand that everybody that is a politician brings a political lens to the discussion, and there's always an element of partisanship that can come into play. But that said, I think we are developing very quickly a critical mass that would allow us to move forward. The one country that we were a little worried about was Australia. It took a while to get some traction and momentum there. And I think, James, you'll agree with me, over the last few months, we've seen significant movement forward in that respect. I want to give kudos to Senator Eric Abetz for his role in stimulating a discussion and bringing together a group of like-minded parliamentarians in their country. I also want to pay kudos to Simon O'Connor in New Zealand, who's agreed to take up the cause in New Zealand and to lead an APPG type of parliamentary group there as well. And here in Canada, I'm just seeking direction on what that might look like, but I hope to also create a formal group in Canada. But I want to say that in Canada, there is, amongst our non-political stakeholders, it's very clear that there is a consensus developing that CANZUK is a worthy initiative to support. There is not one major industry organization that has said, no, we are concerned about this or that. They've all said, listen, if it's as you have put it, we will embrace this because this is good for our industry, it's good for our country, and it's good for the global trading system. Let's move forward with something like this so that our 4 countries can carve out a place as leaders when it comes to freer trade, more open investment, common approaches to foreign policy, and on it goes. I would note this, as I've been turning over these rocks that I mentioned earlier, things like environmental policy came forward, things like rare earths, which are critical in the high-tech manufacturing space. Australia and Canada together amongst them have the largest reserve of rare earths. But we also know there are hostile actors in the world that have already in the past sought to stockpile these and to manage these in a way that serves their purposes and impoverishes the rest of the world. We believe there's an opportunity to come up with a common policy on rare earths. Well, that will be fair and that will continue to serve the global community. So I have a whole list of these things that have been unearthed as I've met with stakeholders. So CANZUK is much broader than simply trade and investment. And that is the message that I hope all of us communicate as we promote this very worthy endeavor.
Thank you. And it looks like your hard work's paying off now, like you say, with Australia finally starting to edge on board. But I'll put this question next to you, Craig. Do you think how long and how do you think it would come about, especially from a UK point of view, being a UK British Member of Parliament? How long do you think? And do you think the groundwork's already there for us to be one of the forefront of this, pushing for it?
Well, look, we're re-emerging back onto the world stage. We've got to be a little bit bashful for a while before we start demanding things happen at a pace. But I think the UK strategic intent is pretty clear. We have mentioned over and over again CPTPP, and our formal application is now in. I agree with that. It's not all about trade. However, the fact we are fast tracking, or whatever word you want to use, working at pace on our application and wanting to co-align with that body of countries, that helps. When you get this critical mass, when you announce finally that we are so co-aligned on so many policies that we form this major international body. That's an interesting question. We clearly already have bilats, we have agreements in place, which gives us quite a formidable weapons in the arsenal in terms of trade aspects, in terms of security aspects, in terms of so much mutual respect. But I think given that we are re-emerging, we want closer relationships to deal with the challenges, and if we can only include in this agreement the information Ed finds under every rock, it's going to be worth it. But I really think that the fact we are working at such a pace, and the UK PLC, UK Gov has made our intent clear in this direction. Hopefully that generates a bit of a push. And the rare earths point that Ed makes is such a powerful one. And we shouldn't be bashful about the kind of global leverage that this body of countries would have on so many issues.
Thank you. And I'll put this last question just before we finish to you, James.
Yeah, and again, maybe I can provide a bit of an advocacy perspective to this. It's an interesting question. It's certainly challenging to. I mean, I'm sure anybody perhaps tuning into this right now who's perhaps part of a non-profit or another advocacy group will know that it's incredibly difficult to advocate and create change in one country. So imagine trying to do it in 4 countries, all of whom have 10 plus time zones. And God knows how many times I've had to get up at 3 a.m. in the morning to provide a presentation to a minister in Australia or New Zealand. So it is challenging to affect that change in 4 countries. The beautiful side of that, obviously, like we've alluded to so many times in this this meeting, is that obviously Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, very like-minded. And as I've already mentioned through the polling, obviously the support is there, of course. So I have no doubt it's going to happen in the future. The problem, again, with it being 4 separate countries, that, of course, every government of every country can perhaps be well, they'll all have their own agendas. So on one day, CANZUK could be quite high on the agenda. Another day could happen, COVID-19, a massive pandemic breaks out, and of course, CANZUK falls way down to the bottom of the agenda. Now, you times that by 4 countries, and it becomes challenging. And there's been many a times where I've been ripping my hair out, thinking, "Oh God, how are we going to get this moving forward?" But it is certainly moving forward. I see just from the public and the political support and the engagement we've had, that it will certainly move forward. I think it'll realistically, as much as I would love it to happen all in one go, I would love the prime ministers of these countries just to snap their fingers and say, yeah, okay, CANZUK is now a reality. I can't see that being the case, because obviously there's got to be a lot of research and a lot of policy work done from the government side to make it happen. But I do see it happening in piecemeal segments, so to speak. So for example, taking reciprocal migration, that could be implemented in the case of, expanding the current visas that we have between, for example, the UK and Australia from 2 years to 5 years, and then with Canada from 2 years to 5 years, and then expanding the age range, and then expanding that over the course of maybe 5, 6, 7 years or so. And then of course, trade would be the same thing. Foreign policy would be a little bit easier to implement, I think, because we already have a lot of the framework in place there. So I see it coming into stages in a sort of like piecemeal agreements. But I think certainly just with the momentum that we've got and the public support, the political support, how everything is falling into place, I certainly see CANZUK being a reality, or close to a reality, certainly within the next few years ahead. I don't think we're going to be waiting 10, 20, 30 years for this to happen. I think it's something that's definitely on the horizon.
Well, let's hope so. And we're going to wrap this up now. I said that was the last question. We just hit on 8 o'clock. So I just want to say thank you firstly to our amazing panelists, Craig, James and Ed. You've been fantastic for to answer these and really showed your insight and answering these questions from our attendees. It's been amazing to have you on. Hopefully we'll have you on again soon. Hopefully CANZUK's move forward by the time we all next meet again. And I just want to say thank you to the attendees who've asked great questions and came along to this. And I'm sure we'll see you in a couple of weeks at our next one. So thank you guys, and speak soon.